So you made decisions along the way, as we all do. And you probably remember a few of them as perhaps more fortuitous than others, but talk a little bit about where you specifically remember thinking, I'm going to go this direction rather than this direction, and that kind of opened up your journey and really led you to where you are today. Do you remember any of those singular waypoints?
Of course. There's been many of them, right? Like, and in many different directions, because I sure haven't taken a very straight path to where I am today. Like, probably one of the earliest one was when I first fell in love with computers in a way, right? Like, and dating myself, this was also well before the internet and so on, right? Like, I think the very first I got to see was like a Pong machine or something, right? Like, and it was just
I agree.
pretty magical that like you could turn those little knobs and the screen did something, right? Like, in some way there was some kind of like place in there that was like interactive and you could do things with, and then started begging my parents for a computer until I convinced them to give me a Commodore 64 in the early years, right? Like, and just, again, just that magic that you could type some stuff and then you would have this like program that you could interact with, right? Like, from like the instruction manual, building a little guessing game, right? Like, just the fact that like, hey, I built something that someone else could interact with and would interact back just immediately seemed magical in a way, right? And then, of course, like, next, the first time I visited a friend that had a modem, right? Like, and we realized, like, I don't know, back then it was like even pre-web, right? Like, so it was like we would find a list of BBSs that you could call up on your modem and like see what was happening there, right? Like, and suddenly you're chatting from Denmark with someone in the US, right? Like, and it's like, wow, it's like someone is on the other side, and like it happens inside this virtual world, right? Like, reading those old William Gibson cyberpunk books, a similar way of like triggering that like curiosity. Meanwhile, I never saw it as like, it was early enough. Like, I grew up in a family where my mom was a conservatory teacher and a professional pianist. My dad was a radio producer and presenter. Everybody was worried about me spending all this time just in front of a computer. Like, what's going to become of him, right? And I picked up on my own. I found the piano and like went and studied, took a bachelor in musicology and literature, and then started a major in cultural studies while working as a freelance musical journalist. All the time programming as a hobby and a passion, and something I just felt was like I still had just that initial bug from the first time I experienced the computer. And then I met a girl from Spain and like went and visited her. She came and visited me, and I went there a bit, and I thought like, okay, I'm going to go to Madrid, stay there for like 3 months and finish up my master's thesis. Went there and pretty quickly realized, okay, I'm going to stay for more than 3 months. And also the market for writing about music in Danish in Madrid was not great. It was like, okay, I probably need a plan B. I'd always just been building stuff, right? Like, so I started building some different web stuff, really, like a Sudoku challenge online, this browser-based procedurally generated space game and so on. And before I really finished that, someone discovered it and hired me as one of the early engineers on a Denver-based social media startup, and then worked there and learned a bunch there, and then ran into some people at a Ruby on Rails conference, and they hired me for a startup in Madrid. And somehow over a couple of years, I went from being an engineer to tech lead to director of technology and then CTO of the company. And then I started a startup, as I mentioned in the beginning, in Spain. Came to the Bay Area, working with that, and then saw sort of this broad opportunity in like, what if there's a real profound architecture shift about to happen on the web? How can I accelerate that? How can I be part of making the web like the best platform? And that led me to starting Netlify.
So what do you think separated you to become entrepreneurial? I mean, there are a lot of people who find the path that you found and are perfectly content to just work their way right up to the CTO level and be perfectly content in a large company or wherever. What triggered you to say, no, I want to go build something that I build? And secondarily, what is it about you, or what would you say people should think about in terms of understanding themselves that allows you to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's hard to come up with a single answer, right? Like I always, like, even when I look at it's funny to see, right? Like when I look at the old group of people I would hang out with in high school, right? Like we were always sort of an odd bunch, never part of like the popular kids or anything, and like doing weird things. And we're definitely not like looking like we were in any specific path to any specific career and so on, right? Like, but when I look back, like one of them ended up becoming my co-founder at Netlify many years after we had been apart from a long time, and both of us had gone started companies independently, and like another became like serial entrepreneur, another like there was just like this whole stretch to like, who is it I even found it interesting just instinctively to be around. And there was kind of always people that had some kind of builder in them, right? Like, and people that didn't really see life as like a straight path of like, I have to go get my job and my wife and my kid and my car and my like, but that were more driven by curiosity and impact, right? Like, and I think that's probably what's been key to me, right? Like I've always been sort of more driven by what what can I do that have some really interesting impact, and what can we come up with?
I think it's interesting that you found folks in your youth that all effectively became entrepreneurial, and yet you didn't realize at the time that you were becoming friends that maybe there was some I don't know, there's some collective skill set or traits that brought you together that would lead you to want to start companies independently.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny, right? Like, and everybody just had a little off the cuff, like just doing stuff, right? Like, like we had this weird experience. It's like my co-founder and I, right? Like again, we didn't know we would start, like when we knew each other, we were mainly playing computer games and going to a lot of jazz concerts, right? And then I went to Madrid and I started this whole journey. At that time, he was studying film and media and I was studying cultural studies, right? Like he built a production company in the space of like Flash microsites with like mixing interactive video with Flash, and sold it right at the right point before Flash stopped being a thing and became a chief digital officer and partner in an agency when I reached out and was sort of like, hey, let's do something together, right? And we went a while after we had started Netlify to this like dinner with Index Ventures in San Francisco for Nordic founders, and hadn't thought about any like that we recognized anyone, and it was like this like controlled discussion around the table on specific topic and so on. And then when we're done, the guy sitting right in front of me like suddenly asks, hey, do you by any chance know this guy called Jimmy? And Jimmy was like one of our old friends back from high school. That was like an interesting character. Like he ended up moving to Thailand and then Cambodia, and like who knows what he's doing now. But he was like a very unlikely tie-in to anyone you would sit with as at an Index Venture dinner. And both me and Chris started laughing, and it turned out the guy in front of me was this guy Ingvar that we'd always just like been at LAN parties together at Jimmy's house or at my house and so on, right? Like I hadn't recognized him as first. And it turns out that his brother is the VC from Index Ventures that invited us. And it turns out his other brother is the founder of Unity, right? Like, and it's like, who would have thought? So I don't really know what it was, but there was definitely something that brought all of us sort of like oddballs together back then, way before any of us were doing any obvious things that would lead us on this path.
Well, so what makes you good at it? And what would you say for somebody considering becoming an entrepreneur, they should maybe take an inventory of? I mean, what is it? What are kind of some of the DNA elements of a good entrepreneur?
I don't think there's one set, because there's so many. Like, the whole thing I would say is that when you take a path as just going and building a company, there isn't really any blueprint in the same way as when you follow some career ladder, right? Like, there you're sort of judged by a system that will say, like, this is how you perform here, right? Like, when you go start something, it's kind of up to you to come up with those parameters, right? Like, so the first quality is to be okay with that, right? Like, you got to be really okay with a lot of uncertainty. You got to be very, very stubborn, I think. Like, you just have to have something like innately, deeply stubborn in you, because, like, no matter what you do, if what you're doing is actually a good idea, it's also going to be a weird idea in the beginning to anybody else, right? Like, you're rarely going to get success with something that seems completely obvious from the beginning, because then everybody would be doing it, right? Like, so in the early stages, you got to be like, the whole way through have this stubbornness of thinking like, okay, everybody else might think this is stupid, but I think it's like real. And it's also really hard, right? Like, it's not like every sort of sudden emergent story is something always have a lot of grind behind it, right? Like, and even when you start building and get bigger, like, that grind never ends, right? Like, so you have to have a lot of just pure grit and persistence, and just like, again, I think it's just, to me, it comes down to essentially being very, very stubborn in some ways, right? Like, and then on top of that, it's just very different what people are good at, right? Like, some people are amazing go-to-market people, right? Like, and it's just amazing at coming up with a creative way of selling something that might not be like unique. Some people are inventors and are good at coming up with something that other people wouldn't have come up with. Some are really good at seeing like trends and understanding where the landscape is going and what could be interesting to build if the landscape is going there, right? Like, that can really vary, but I think there's core characteristics of being willing to be a contrarian, to be very stubborn and very persistent. Those are kind of like a foundation that without those, you gotta give up along the way.
Well, and you also have to be somewhat charismatic, because in the end, you can't just be an entrepreneur by yourself. You have to start to assemble a team, and people have to believe you. I mean, there has to be. I mean, you can believe in something, but if you can't convince anybody else, it's going to be a very lonely entrepreneurial journey. And in the end, I think the only way you can become notable, like yourself, is to find co-founders, but also find that next layer, that team to build. What do you look for in folks when you're starting to build a team?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Like, because of course it always changes along the journey, right? Like, it all depends, right? Like, some founders come with just like an amazing network they've already built in the Bay Area, and they just tap those people and they've worked with them before, right? Like, I didn't have that advantage. I came from like Denmark and Spain and started something here and didn't have much of a network, so I couldn't go for just pulling in my network. I had to try to find people, right? Like, and I always found that you got to find that early stage, you got to find people that for whatever reason are strange enough that instead of going to work for some big company with a really safe salary and like a very clear like outcome of what they're getting and so on, for some reason don't want that. They want to sort of challenge themselves to something challenging and odd and weird and see if they can have real impact, right? Like, so the first, when you're starting in these early stages, you got to find that, right? Like, and you got to look for people early on that have potential ahead of them rather than a ton of experience behind them, right? Like, because again, if someone has been forever in big companies, they're probably just going to be very used to that kind of lifestyle and salary, and they're going to want to go on, right? Like, so typically you're looking for people that have like some patterns of having jumped a bit and done different things and trying to figure out a path that's really interesting for them, and that are not totally comfortable with like the big company model, and that also, to be fair, might not like last with you if you become a big company, because then they'll start feeling that that's a pain again, right? Like, but you want to find those early ones that are really focused on like thinking that a real challenge is they're not afraid of it. They think it, they're drawn to it, and that want to really like be builders and create something, and that has talent ahead of them, right?